Shadows on a quiet evening. The town of Cedarwood was as picturesque as small towns came. Nestled between rolling hills and sprawling maple forests, its tight-knit community prided itself on fairness, neighborly values, and justice. At the heart of this idyllic setting was Councilman Elias Morgan, a man celebrated for his unwavering dedication to the people. For over a decade, Elias had worked tirelessly to advocate for underserved neighborhoods, fight systemic inequality, and champion transparency in government. In Cedarwood, he was not just a politician, but a symbol of hope. It was an ordinary autumn evening when Elias decided to take a rare moment for himself. The cool breeze carried the faint scent of wood smoke and damp earth as he strolled down Main Street. Streetlights cast long shadows on the cobblestone paths, and the town square was unusually quiet, save for the occasional distant laughter from a nearby diner. Elias had always loved walking through the heart of Cedarwood. It reminded him of why he fought so hard. Small businesses lining the streets, families gathering in the square, and children playing in the park. Tonight, however, there was a lingering unease in the air. As Elias turned a corner, two police cruisers were parked at odd angles near the alley by the bakery. He thought nothing of it at first. After all, Cedarwood was not without its minor infractions. But as he approached, two uniformed officers stepped out, their expressions cold and guarded. "Councilman Morgan," one of them called out, his voice sharp and deliberate. Elias stopped, surprised. "Yes, officer. Is something wrong?" The officers exchanged a glance. The taller one, Sergeant Grant, stepped forward, his hand resting on the baton at his hip. "We need you to come with us. There's been a report." Elias frowned. "A report of what?" "You matched the description of a suspect involved in a string of burglaries," Grant said, his tone flat. Elias blinked, momentarily stunned. "That's preposterous. I've been in meetings all day, and I just left my office an hour ago. Surely there's a mistake." The second officer, a younger man with a nervous demeanor, hesitated. "Sir, if you could just cooperate, we can clear this up quickly." Elias raised his hand slightly, palms out in a gesture of peace. "I'm cooperating, but I need to understand why I'm being stopped. Have you verified the description? Do you have probable cause?" Grant's jaw tightened. "We don't have time for questions. Hands where I can see them." The hostility in his voice was palpable. Elias felt his chest tighten as adrenaline coursed through his veins. This wasn't about a report. It was about something deeper, something he had spent years fighting against in the very system he represented. "Sergeant Grant, I am a city councilman. Surely you know me." Elias kept his voice calm but firm. "Oh, we know exactly who you are," Grant replied with a sneer. "Doesn't mean you're above the law." Before Elias could respond, Grant grabbed his arm, twisting it behind his back. The sudden, unnecessary force drew a gasp from Elias and cries of alarm from onlookers who had begun to gather. "Isn't that Councilman Morgan?" someone whispered. "This has to be a mistake," another voice murmured. Elias gritted his teeth against the pain, his heart pounding. "I'm not resisting," he said through clenched teeth. "There's no need for this." But his protests were ignored. The younger officer hesitated but eventually helped his partner cuff Elias. They'd marched him to the patrol car as the murmurs of the growing crowd turned into shouts. "This is wrong," a woman yelled. "He's not a criminal." "Leave him alone," cried an older man. Inside the patrol car, Elias's mind raced. The humiliation, the betrayal, and the sheer absurdity of the situation were almost too much to process. He thought of his family, his constituents, and the years he had spent fighting for justice. Was this what it all amounted to? The ride to the station felt like an eternity. When they arrived, Elias was led through the booking process like any common criminal. Fingerprints, mugshot, and a cold holding cell. The metal bench beneath him was unforgiving, the silence deafening. Hours passed. In the darkness, Elias thought about all the people he had met during his years in office, People who had shared stories of being unfairly targeted, detained, or humiliated. He had always fought for them, promising to dismantle the structures that allowed such injustices. Now he was living their reality. Finally, the door to the holding cell creaked open. The police chief, a stocky man with a graying beard, stepped inside. His face was a mixture of anger and shame. "Councilman Morgan," he began, his voice heavy, "I just learned about this. I am so sorry." Elias stood, his composure remarkably intact. "An apology won't undo what's been done, Chief," he said, his voice steady but piercing. "What happened tonight wasn't just a mistake. It's a symptom of a much larger problem." The chief nodded, his shoulders slumping. "You're right. This should never have happened. You'll be released immediately, and I'll personally see to it that this is made right." As Elias stepped out of the station, the morning sun was just beginning to rise, casting an eerie glow over the town he had served so faithfully. A crowd had gathered outside: supporters, reporters, and curious onlookers. Elias paused, taking a deep breath before addressing the cameras thrust in his direction. "This isn't just about me," he began, his voice carrying the weight of the night's events. "What happened to me is something that happens to countless others who don't have the privilege of a title or a platform. It's a systemic issue that we can no longer ignore." The crowd erupted into cheers and applause, but Elias's heart remained heavy. He knew this was just the beginning. If Cedarwood prided itself on fairness and justice, it was time to prove it, not with words, but with action. As the cameras flashed and reporters shouted questions, Elias vowed to himself that he would turn this nightmare into a catalyst for change. Cedarwood would never be the same again. Echoes of injustice. The events of the previous night rippled through Cedarwood like a stone cast into still water. By morning, everyone in town was talking about the unjust arrest of Councilman Elias Morgan. News vans lined the streets around City Hall, reporters clamoring for sound bites, while social media exploded with hashtags like #JusticeForElias and #profiling in Cedarwood. At his modest home on the south side of town, Elias sat at his kitchen table, nursing a cup of coffee he had no appetite for. His wife, Clara, stood behind him, her hands resting gently on his shoulders. "They humiliated you," she said softly, her voice trembling with anger. "How could they? After everything you've done for this town." Elias took a deep breath, his fingers tapping rhythmically on the table. "This isn't about me, Clara. It's about what this represents. If they could do this to me, a councilman, what chance does an ordinary person have?" Clara nodded, her eyes welling up. "So what are you going to do?" Elias stood, his resolve solidifying with every step. "I'm going to fight, not just for me, but for everyone who has ever been unfairly judged or mistreated. It's time Cedarwood faced its truth." The morning reckoning. By late morning, Elias walked into the bustling City Hall, where his fellow council members had convened an emergency meeting. The large chamber was packed with reporters, concerned citizens, and activists. The buzz of conversations quieted as Elias stepped to the podium, his presence commanding attention. "I stand before you not as a victim," he began, his voice steady and clear, "but as a representative of those who have no voice. What happened to me last night was not an isolated incident. It is a reflection of the systemic issues we've ignored for far too long." Murmurs rippled through the room. Some council members shifted uncomfortably in their seats, while others nodded in agreement. Elias continued, his voice rising with conviction. "Cedarwood prides itself on being a beacon of fairness and justice. But how fair is it when a man can be arrested simply because he fits a description? How just is it when those tasked with protecting us use their power to oppress instead?" A hand shot up in the audience. It was Reverend Samuel, a well-known community leader. "Councilman Morgan," he called out, "what do you propose we do?" Elias met the Reverend's gaze, his eyes blazing with determination. "We start by holding those responsible accountable. Transparency in policing, mandatory body cameras, and bias training for all officers. But it doesn't stop there. We need to review every policy, every protocol, and ensure they align with the values we claim to uphold. Applause erupted from the crowd, but not everyone was pleased. Councilman Richard Hayes, a staunch traditionalist, stood abruptly. "This is outrageous," Hayes bellowed. "You're turning a simple mistake into a political spectacle. Are we to vilify our police force for doing their job?" Elias didn't flinch. "Their job is to protect and serve, not to profile and detain without cause. A mistake would be forgivable if it didn't stem from deep-seated prejudice." The room fell silent as Hayes glared at Elias, then sank back into his seat, visibly flustered. The chief's dilemma. Meanwhile, at the Cedarwood Police Department, Chief Bernard Reese was in damage control mode. The walls of his office were plastered with news clippings and letters of commendation from his decades-long career. Now they felt like relics of a past he could barely recognize. Sergeant Grant and Officer Lewis, the two who had arrested Elias, stood before him, their postures stiff and defensive. "Do you realize what you've done?" Reese barked, slamming his palm on the desk. "You've not only tarnished this department's reputation, but also put the entire town under a microscope." Grant, ever defiant, crossed his arms. "Chief, we followed procedure." He matched the description. "Procedure." Reese cut him off. "Your so-called procedure was riddled with bias. You arrested a councilman without probable cause. Did you even check the surveillance footage of the burglaries?" Grant hesitated, the silence deafening. "I thought so," Reese said, his voice low and venomous. "You didn't follow procedure. You followed your prejudice. And now, the entire department is paying the price." Officer Lewis, younger and clearly shaken, finally spoke up. "Chief, I didn't want to escalate things. But Grant said we had to act quickly." Reese shook his head, his disappointment palpable. "Acting quickly doesn't mean acting recklessly. You should have questioned him, pushed back. Instead, you let this happen." Turning back to his desk, Reese picked up the phone. "From this moment forward, I want body cameras mandatory on every patrol. I want an internal review of every arrest made in the last 2 years for signs of bias. And you two are suspended pending investigation." Grant's face turned red with anger, but he said nothing. Lewis looked like he might cry. As they left the office, Reese sat heavily in his chair, rubbing his temples. He knew this wasn't just about 2 officers. It was about a culture that had been allowed to fester. Change wouldn't come easily, but it had to start now. Community rising. By late afternoon, Cedarwood's town square was a sea of people. Community leaders, activists, students, and families had gathered to show their support for Elias and to demand accountability. Signs reading "Justice for All" and "End Racial Profiling" waved in the air, while chants echoed through the streets. Elias stood on a makeshift stage, flanked by Clara and Reverend Samuel. He felt the weight of their expectations, but also the strength of their support. "When we stand together," Elias began, his voice amplified through a crackling microphone, "we are unstoppable. This movement isn't about me. It's about all of us. It's about ensuring that no one in Cedarwood, no one in this country, ever has to endure what I did." The crowd roared in agreement. "But change doesn't happen overnight," he continued. "It requires persistence, courage, and accountability. That's why I'm calling on every resident of Cedarwood to join me in this fight. Attend the town hall meetings, speak out against injustice, and hold your leaders accountable, including me." A young woman in the crowd, holding a toddler on her hip, shouted, "We're with you, Councilman. Cedarwood deserves better." Elias smiled, his resolve deepening. He knew this was just the beginning. The road ahead would be long and fraught with challenges, but he was ready. Together, they would rebuild Cedarwood into the beacon of fairness it claimed to be. As the sun set over the town square, Elias looked out at the sea of determined faces. This wasn't just a moment of outrage. It was the birth of a movement. Turning pain into power. The energy in Cedarwood was electric, crackling with a mixture of outrage and determination. The injustice dealt to Councilman Elias Morgan had awakened something in the town, a collective realization that the values they prided themselves on had been eroded by complacency. For Elias, the movement wasn't just about his arrest. It was about uprooting systemic bias and rebuilding the foundation of trust between the people and the institutions meant to serve them. In his modest office, now crowded with stacks of papers, phones ringing incessantly, and volunteers bustling about, Elias sat at the center of the storm, strategizing. Across from him sat Clara, ever his anchor, and Reverend Samuel, who had become a crucial ally in the fight. "We need to do more than rally," Samuel said, leaning forward, his voice brimming with urgency. "This town has been simmering with unspoken issues for years. What happened to you brought it all to the surface, but if we don't act swiftly, the momentum could fade." Elias nodded, scanning the list of demands drafted by the community. "You're right. We need measurable actions. Transparency in the police department, an independent review board, mandatory training to root out bias. It all starts here." Clara placed a hand on his arm. "Elias, you've always been a fighter, but this fight is bigger than anything you faced. Are you ready for the backlash?" Elias met her gaze, his resolve unwavering. "If not me, then who?" The resistance forms. At the Cedarwood Police Department, Chief Bernard Reese faced a battle of his own. Implementing reforms in a system resistant to change was proving to be a Herculean task. Officers, particularly veterans like Sergeant Grant, were pushing back against the new mandates. "This is ridiculous," Grant muttered as he stormed into Reese's office. "Body cameras, mandatory training, an independent review board. It's an insult to our profession." Reese looked up from his desk, his expression calm but firm. "It's accountability, Grant. If we don't clean house, someone else will do it for us, and it'll be much worse." Grant scoffed. "Accountability. This is pandering to public outrage. Morgan's arrest was unfortunate, sure, but we were just doing our job." Reese's voice hardened. "Your job is to protect and serve. What you did was neither. This department has a chance to be part of the solution, or will become the problem everyone points to. Your choice." Grant left, grumbling under his breath, but Reese knew the battle wasn't over. Resistance from within the ranks would be a constant obstacle, but he was determined to stay the course. Building bridges. Back in Elias's office, the movement was gaining traction beyond Cedarwood. Civil rights organizations, journalists, and even state representatives had reached out, offering support. Elias knew that the fight needed a broader platform to create lasting change. Reverend Samuel suggested a town hall, a public forum where residents could voice their concerns directly to officials. "Let the people see that we're not just talking about change. We're involving them in it," he said. The idea resonated, and within days, the Cedarwood Community Center was transformed into a hub of dialogue. Rows of folding chairs filled the space, and a panel of officials, including Elias and Chief Reese, sat at the front. The room buzzed with tension as residents filed in, their faces a mix of hope and anger. Elias stood to address the crowd. "Good evening," he began, his voice steady despite the weight of the moment. "I'm here tonight, not as a councilman, but as a member of this community. What happened to me is just one example of a much larger problem, and it's time we confronted it together." A young man in the audience stood, his voice quivering with emotion. "Councilman Morgan, my brother was arrested last year for something he didn't do. He sat in jail for weeks before the charges were dropped. Nobody apologized, and his life hasn't been the same since." Elias nodded solemnly. "Your brother's story is why we're here. This isn't just about fixing one mistake. It's about dismantling the systems that allow those mistakes to happen over and over." Chief Reese took the microphone, his tone measured. "As head of the Cedarwood Police Department, I take full responsibility for what happened. We failed Councilman Morgan, and we failed others in this community. That's why I'm committing to reforms that will ensure accountability and rebuild trust." The room erupted into applause, though some murmurs of skepticism remained. The pushback. Not everyone in Cedarwood embraced the changes. A small but vocal group of residents, led by Councilman Richard Hayes, organized a counter-movement. They argued that the reforms were anti-police and would undermine the safety of the town. At a rally in the park, Hayes addressed his supporters. "This town has always been a safe haven because of our hardworking officers. Now, certain people want to tear that apart with unnecessary oversight and politically motivated agendas. We cannot let that happen." Elias watched the footage of the rally later that evening, his jaw tightening. Clara, sitting beside him, placed a comforting hand on his shoulder. "Don't let them distract you. Stay focused on the people who believe in what you're doing." Seeds of change. The next day, Elias visited the local high school to speak with students about the importance of civic engagement. In the auditorium, hundreds of young faces looked up at him, their expressions a mixture of curiosity and admiration. "You are the future of Cedarwood," Elias said, pacing the stage. "The changes we're fighting for now will shape the world you inherit. But real change doesn't happen without action. It starts with voting, volunteering, and holding your leaders accountable, including me." Afterward, a young girl approached him, her notebook clutched tightly to her chest. "Councilman Morgan," she said shyly, "I want to be like you someday." Elias smiled, his heart swelling with pride. "Then don't let anyone tell you that you can't. Speak up, even when it's hard. Especially when it's hard." A new beginning. As weeks turned into months, Cedarwood began to transform. The town hall meetings became a regular occurrence, fostering open dialogue between residents and officials. The police department implemented new protocols, and the independent review board began auditing past cases. The movement inspired other towns in the region to reevaluate their own policies, and Elias found himself invited to speak at conferences and panels. But for him, the real victory was seeing Cedarwood slowly become the beacon of fairness it had always claimed to be. On a crisp spring morning, Elias stood on the steps of City Hall, looking out at the bustling town square. The journey had been painful and exhausting, but it had also been worth it. Cedarwood was not perfect, no place ever was, but it was better, stronger, more just. And as the town moved forward, so did Elias, carrying the lessons of the past with him and turning pain into power for a brighter future. The battle he didn't expect. Elias Morgan thought the hardest battles were behind him. The night he spent in a cold cell and the days of defending his integrity felt like a distant storm. But as the weeks passed, he realized that the true battle was just beginning, one that would test his resilience and expose the fractures within Cedarwood's seemingly tight-knit community. The morning sun was harsh as Elias walked into City Hall, where the first official hearing on police reforms was scheduled. It was standing room only in the chamber. Supporters of the reform movement filled one side, waving signs that read "Justice for all" and "Accountability now." On the other side, a smaller but vocal group held placards that read "Support our police" and "Stop politicizing law enforcement." Elias took his seat at the front, next to Reverend Samuel, who had become an unshakable ally. Across from them sat Councilman Richard Hayes, his arms crossed, lips pursed into a thin line. Hayes had positioned himself as the face of the opposition, using fear and nostalgia to rally those who were resistant to change. The hearing began with testimonies. The first speaker, a middle-aged woman named Rosa Martinez, described how her teenage son had been arrested for loitering near his own home. "They said he fit the description," she said, her voice cracking. "He was just coming back from the store. He was scared, confused, and they didn't even apologize when they realized they had the wrong person." The crowd murmured in anger, and Rosa's words hung in the air like a weight pressing on everyone's chest. Next, Hayes stood, his face etched with righteous indignation. "What happened to Councilman Morgan was unfortunate, yes," he began, his voice smooth but calculated. "But we cannot let one incident tarnish the reputation of our hardworking officers. These reforms are not about accountability. They're about weakening our police force and putting our town at risk. The tension in the room was palpable. Elias leaned forward, his hands clasped tightly. When it was finally his turn to speak, he rose with calm authority. "I've heard the concerns from both sides," he began, scanning the room. "And I understand the fears. But let me ask you this. What kind of safety are we talking about if it comes at the expense of justice? Can we truly call ourselves a fair and just community if we allow unchecked power to overshadow the rights of our citizens?" His words were met with applause from his supporters and muttered discontent from the opposition. Hayes smirked, leaning back in his chair as if anticipating a misstep. Elias continued, his voice steady. "This isn't about weakening our police force. It's about strengthening it by ensuring it operates with integrity and accountability. A community that trusts its police is a safer community for everyone." The room erupted in debate. Voices clashed, arguments spilled over, and the chamber became a cacophony of opposing views. The mayor, a weary-looking man in his 50s, banged his gavel repeatedly until the noise subsided. "We'll reconvene tomorrow," the mayor announced, his tone exasperated. "Let's all take a breath and come back with clearer minds." Behind closed doors. That evening, Elias sat at his desk, poring over documents outlining the proposed reforms. Clara entered the room, carrying 2 cups of tea. She placed one in front of him and took a seat across from him. "You were incredible today," she said, her voice filled with pride. Elias gave her a tired smile. "It doesn't feel like it. Hayes has a way of twisting the narrative, and it's working. People are scared of change." Clara reached out, taking his hand. "You've always said the hardest fights are the ones worth fighting. You're planting seeds, Elias. It'll take time for them to grow." Their moment was interrupted by a knock at the door. Reverend Samuel stepped in, his expression grim. He carried a stack of papers and a USB drive. "What is it?" Elias asked, sensing the weight of his friend's demeanor. Samuel sat down, placing the items on the desk. "I've been digging into Hayes' history. There's something you need to see." Elias inserted the USB into his laptop and began scrolling through the files. What he saw made his stomach turn. Hayes had deep ties to a local real estate developer notorious for displacing minority families under the guise of urban renewal. The same developer had donated heavily to Hayes' campaign. "This is why he's fighting so hard against the reforms," Samuel said. "He's protecting his interests, not the people of Cedarwood." Elias leaned back, his mind racing. Exposing Hayes could strengthen the movement, but it could also escalate tensions in the community. He knew he had to tread carefully. The power of truth. The next day, the chamber was packed again, the atmosphere even more charged than before. Elias stood, addressing the crowd. "Before we continue with the testimonies, I'd like to share some information that has come to light," he began, his tone measured. "Councilman Hayes has been a vocal opponent of these reforms, claiming they're unnecessary and harmful. But the question we must ask is, who benefits from maintaining the status quo?" Elias displayed documents on the screen behind him, detailing Hayes' connections to the developer. Gasps echoed through the room, and Hayes shot to his feet. "This is a smear campaign," Hayes shouted, his face red with anger. "You're deflecting because you know your reforms are flawed." Elias turned to face him, his expression calm. "This isn't about me, Richard. It's about transparency. The people of Cedarwood deserve to know the truth." The chamber erupted into chaos, the mayor struggling to restore order. Hayes stormed out, but the damage was done. His credibility was in tatters. The community speaks. In the days that followed, the revelations about Hayes dominated local news. Support for the reforms surged, and Elias found himself at the center of a growing movement. Town hall meetings became forums for storytelling, where residents shared their experiences with systemic bias and called for change. One evening, a young woman named Tasha stood up to speak. "I used to think my voice didn't matter," she said, her voice trembling. But seeing what Councilman Morgan has done makes me believe we can make a difference. Cedarwood can be better, but it starts with us." Her words resonated deeply, and Elias felt a renewed sense of purpose. This wasn't just his fight. It was a collective effort, a community rising together. The turning point. As the vote on the reforms approached, the tension in Cedarwood reached a boiling point. On the night before the council meeting, Elias received a call from Chief Reese. "I thought you should know," Reese said, his voice grave. "Grant and a few others are organizing a protest against the reforms. They're calling it a blue stand." Elias sighed, running a hand through his hair. "They have a right to protest, but so do we." The next morning, the town square was divided. On one side, a group of officers and their supporters stood in defiance of the reforms. On the other, an even larger group of residents held signs calling for justice and accountability. Elias stood at the center, addressing the crowd. "This is what democracy looks like," he said, gesturing to both sides. "A community coming together to voice its concerns. But let us not forget that the goal is not division, it's unity. It's about building a Cedarwood where everyone feels safe, valued, and heard." His words carried across the square, bridging the gap between the two groups. By the time the council convened, the tide had turned. The reforms passed with overwhelming support, marking the beginning of a new chapter for Cedarwood. As Elias left City Hall that evening, he felt a sense of quiet triumph. The battle wasn't over, but they had taken the first step. Together, they had proven that even in the face of resistance, justice could prevail. The weight of leadership. The passage of the police reform bill marked a pivotal moment in Cedarwood's history, but it was far from the end of the journey. For Elias Morgan, the victory was bittersweet. Though the reforms were now law, the rift in the community had grown deeper. Friends turned against friends, and neighbors eyed each other with suspicion. It became painfully clear that progress often came with a cost. Elias stood in his living room one evening, staring at the stack of letters on the coffee table. They were a mixture of support and vitriol. Thank you notes from families grateful for the changes, and angry diatribes, accusing him of destroying the town's way of life. He rubbed his temples, exhaustion settling in like a heavy fog. Clara walked in, a steaming mug of chamomile tea in her hands. "You've been at this all day," she said gently, placing the mug on the table. "You need a break." "I can't," Elias replied, his voice tinged with frustration. The reforms were just the first step. There's so much more to do, and the backlash. It's worse than I expected. Clara sat beside him, her hand resting on his. "You can't carry this alone, Elias. The community needs to heal, but so do you." He nodded, her words sinking in, but the weight of responsibility remained. He had become more than a councilman. He was now the face of a movement, a symbol of hope, and to some, a target. The underlying tension. The next morning, Elias met with Reverend Samuel at the Cedarwood Community Center. The two men had become inseparable allies, working tirelessly to bridge the growing divide in the town. "We've made progress, but it feels like we're standing on a fault line," Samuel said, his voice heavy. "One wrong move, and it could all come crashing down." Elias sighed, running a hand over his face. "I know. The reforms were supposed to unite us, but all they've done is expose the fractures. How do we bring people together when they refuse to see eye to eye?" Samuel leaned forward, his expression thoughtful. "We need something more tangible. The reforms were necessary, but they're abstract to most people. We need a project, a community initiative that forces everyone to work together." Elias raised an eyebrow. "Like what?" Samuel's eyes sparkled with a sudden idea. "The old Cedarwood Park. It's been abandoned for years, falling apart piece by piece. What if we rebuilt it, together? Police, residents, everyone. A symbol of what this town can achieve when we work as one." Elias nodded slowly, the idea taking root. "It's ambitious, but maybe ambition is exactly what we need. A new vision. Within days, plans for the Cedarwood Park restoration project were underway. Elias and Samuel rallied volunteers from all corners of the community. Flyers went up around town, and local businesses donated supplies. Even Chief Reese pledged his support, encouraging officers to participate. The project began on a crisp Saturday morning. The park was in worse shape than anyone had imagined. Rusted playground equipment lay half-buried in overgrown grass, and the once beautiful gazebo was little more than a skeleton of rotting wood. Elias arrived early, wearing a simple t-shirt and jeans, ready to get his hands dirty. To his surprise, Sergeant Grant was already there, holding a toolbox. The two men exchanged a cautious nod. "Didn't expect to see you here," Elias said. Grant shrugged, his expression unreadable. "Figured it was time to do something constructive." Elias offered a small smile. "Glad to have you." As the morning progressed, more people arrived. Families brought their children, business owners closed their shops to lend a hand, and even some of the most vocal opponents of the reforms showed up. For the first time in months, it felt like Cedarwood was united, breaking down barriers. By midday, the park was buzzing with activity. Children helped plant flowers, teenagers painted murals, and adults worked side by side to repair the playground and gazebo. The air was filled with laughter, music, and the scent of fresh-cut grass. Elias found himself working next to a woman who had been a vocal critic of the reforms. She was scrubbing graffiti off a bench, her brow furrowed in concentration. "Councilman," she said, glancing at him, "I didn't agree with what you did, but I have to admit, this is a good idea." Elias smiled. "Thank you. I hope this shows that we can find common ground, even if we don't always see eye to eye." She nodded, her expression softening. "Maybe." Nearby, Reverend Samuel organized a lunch break, handing out sandwiches and bottled water donated by local businesses. People gathered under the shade of a large oak tree, sharing stories and laughing like old friends. Even Sergeant Grant was seen cracking a smile. An unexpected crisis. As the sun began to set, the day seemed like an unqualified success. But just as the last volunteers were packing up, a commotion broke out near the parking lot. Two teenagers, one black and one white, were shouting at each other, their voices echoing through the park. Elias rushed over, followed closely by Chief Reese. "What's going on?" Elias asked, stepping between the boys. "He stole my phone," the white teen yelled, pointing at the other boy. "That's a lie," the black teen shot back. "I didn't take anything." The crowd began to gather, tension crackling in the air. Elias raised his hands, his voice firm but calm. "Let's all take a breath. No one's accusing anyone without proof." Chief Reese stepped forward, his tone authoritative but measured. "We'll handle this fairly. Let's check the facts before jumping to conclusions." It turned out to be a misunderstanding. The phone had fallen out of the white teen's pocket near the swings. But the incident left a sour taste in everyone's mouth, a stark reminder of how fragile the peace still was. As the crowd dispersed, Elias stood with Reese, staring at the empty swings. "That could have gone very differently," he said. Reese nodded. "It's a reminder that the work isn't done. But today was a step in the right direction. A glimmer of hope." By the time the park restoration was complete, Cedarwood had transformed, not just physically, but emotionally. The park became a symbol of what the town could achieve when it worked together. Families picnicked on the freshly painted tables, children played on the new equipment, and the gazebo hosted concerts and community meetings. Elias stood at the grand reopening ceremony, watching the diverse crowd mingling and laughing. Clara stood beside him, beaming with pride. "You did it," she said. "We did it," Elias replied, his heart swelling. "But there's still more to do." As he stepped onto the gazebo to deliver his speech, Elias felt a sense of optimism he hadn't felt in months. The road ahead was still long, but for the first time, Cedarwood seemed ready to walk it together. The legacy of courage. The Cedarwood Park Restoration Project had become a beacon of hope, But Elias Morgan knew it was only the beginning. Healing a fractured community required more than shared projects. It demanded trust, understanding, and the willingness to confront uncomfortable truths. As Cedarwood continued its journey toward unity, Elias found himself balancing the weight of progress against the ever-present resistance, a threat to change. Weeks after the park reopening, the progress Cedarwood had made was threatened. Late one evening, Elias received a call from Chief Bernard Reese. "Elias, we have a problem," Reese said, his voice tight with concern. "Someone vandalized the police station. Graffiti everywhere. Slogans about corruption. They're blaming it on the reform movement." Elias's heart sank. "Have you investigated? Do we know who's responsible?" "Not yet," Reese replied. "But tensions are rising again. We need to address this quickly." The next morning, Elias stood before the police station, staring at the spray-painted words, "Justice is a lie and cops are criminals." A crowd had gathered, their expressions a mix of anger and confusion. Reverend Samuel appeared beside him, shaking his head. "This is a setback," Samuel said, "but it's not the end. We've come too far to let this derail us." Elias stepped forward, addressing the crowd. "This act of vandalism doesn't represent the movement for change. It represents fear. Fear of progress. Fear of accountability. We must respond not with anger, but with resilience. Cedarwood is better than this." His words resonated with many, but the damage had been done. Old wounds reopened, and the fragile unity began to waver. Bridging the divide. Determined to restore trust, Elias organized a town-wide dialogue. Held in the newly restored Cedarwood Park, the event brought together residents, police officers, activists, and business owners. The goal was simple: to listen. The turnout was larger than expected. People sat in folding chairs under the autumn sky, their breath visible in the crisp air. A microphone was set up in the gazebo, and anyone who wanted to speak was given the floor. The first speaker was an elderly man, his hands trembling as he gripped the microphone. "I've lived in this town for 60 years, he began, "and I've seen it change for the better and the worse. What happened to Councilman Morgan was wrong, but we can't let it divide us. Cedarwood is our home. We need to fix this, together." Next, a young woman named Maya, a student at the local high school, stepped up. "I used to think the police didn't care about people like me," she said. "But seeing officers work with us at the park, it gave me hope. We need more of that." Then, to everyone's surprise, Sergeant Grant approached the microphone. He paused, the weight of the moment visible in his posture. "I was wrong," he said, his voice steady but heavy. "I let my biases blind me, and I made mistakes that hurt this community. But I'm here to say I'm ready to change, to be better. I hope you'll give me, and all of us, a chance to prove that." The crowd erupted into applause, and for the first time, Elias saw genuine understanding begin to take root. The catalyst for growth. In the weeks that followed, the dialogue inspired new initiatives. Cedarwood launched a mentorship program pairing police officers with local youth, fostering relationships that humanized both sides. Businesses began hosting community forums, encouraging open conversations about race, justice, and equality. Elias also worked to establish a community-led oversight committee to ensure that the reforms were not just implemented but maintained. Comprised of residents from diverse backgrounds, the committee became a model for other towns facing similar challenges. Personal struggles. Despite the public successes, Elias faced personal challenges. The strain of leadership, combined with the lingering hostility from certain factions, began to take its toll. One evening, after a particularly contentious council meeting, Elias returned home to find Clara waiting for him in the kitchen. "You're wearing yourself thin," she said, her eyes filled with concern. "You can't carry this burden alone." Elias sighed, sinking into a chair. "I know, but every time I think about stepping back, I see the faces of the people counting on me. How can I let them down?" Clara knelt beside him, taking his hands in hers. You're not letting anyone down by taking care of yourself. You've already done so much. Let others carry the torch for a while." Her words stayed with him, and for the first time in months, Elias allowed himself to rest. The day that changed everything. As winter approached, Cedarwood prepared for its annual Unity Festival, an event celebrating the town's history and diversity. This year, the festival carried even greater significance, symbolizing the strides the community had made toward healing. On the day of the festival, Main Street was alive with music, food stalls, and families locking together. The park, now a vibrant centerpiece of the town, hosted performances and art displays created by local children. Elias stood on the stage in the gazebo, watching the crowd with a sense of pride and gratitude. He stepped up to the microphone, the sun casting a golden glow over the park. "Today, we celebrate Cedarwood," he began. "Not just the town we've been, but the town we're becoming. The journey hasn't been easy, and it isn't over. But if we've learned anything this year, it's that when we come together, we can overcome anything." The crowd erupted into cheers, and Elias felt a profound sense of hope. Cedarwood still had its flaws, but it was growing, evolving, and proving that change was possible. A legacy built on justice. As the festival wound down, Elias walked through the park, shaking hands and sharing smiles with residents. He stopped at the playground, where a young boy was climbing the newly restored jungle gym. The boy's mother approached, her eyes filled with gratitude. "Councilman Morgan," she said, "I don't know if you realize how much you've done for this town. My son loves this park. Every time we come here, he sees what's possible when people work together." Elias smiled, his heart full. It wasn't just me. Cedarwood did this, and Cedarwood will keep building. That night, as Elias sat on his porch with Clara, watching the stars, he reflected on the journey. The battles he had fought, the resistance he had faced, and the triumphs he had celebrated had all led to this moment. Cedarwood was far from perfect, but it was on the right path. And for Elias, that was enough.